Chapter 16. US 20, outside Shreveport, Louisiana, early 21st century. Ron LeBain felt awkward behind the wheel of the rental car. For one thing, everything was in a different place than he was used to. He kept reaching for the stick shift and finding it missing. For another, he had to rely completely on the side view mirrors because he couldn't see a thing when he looked over his shoulder. Every time he switched lanes, he expected to hear a crash. Worst of all was the awareness of how much fuel the car was burning, how dirty it was making the air. But he couldn't afford to go to this meeting in such a recognizable vehicle as his own. Success was wonderful, glorious in fact, and usually a lot of fun. But the problem with being a celebrity was that people recognized you. Hence the rental car and a medium-priced business suit complete with tie, white shirt, and loafers. He was willing to bet his own mother wouldn't have known him. Things were going so well. People were finally embracing his message. His book had been on the Times bestseller list for 3 weeks, and each week it had risen a notch. Alone in the car, he gave way to a huge, happy grin. Life was good. His agent had booked him a dozen speaking engagements around the country, charging fees that made Ron blink. And they were paying it. The sheer joy of finally being listened to. It had what he remembered of Weed Beat All Hollow, and it was catching up fast with sex. On his agent's advice, he'd paid $150 for a first-rate haircut, and though he still wore jeans and a work shirt to his lectures, they were now custom-made. The difference was amazing. His clothes were so comfortable, and they actually made him look good. He shook his head. Who'd have thought it? On the advice of his lawyer, his own personal lawyer of all things, he'd sent a check for $20,000 to the commune. On the back of the check, just above the space for the endorsement, the lawyer had written that all the commune's members were required to endorse it, and that cashing the check meant that they renounced all past and future claims to him, his name, or his property. He'd felt a moment's regret for his son, but forced himself to remember that if he'd listened to the members of the commune, he'd be pruning trees right now and raking up leaves, instead of raking in cash. They'd had their chance, and they'd rejected his vision. If they'd stuck by him, they too would be rolling in dough, and all their dreams would be coming true. He turned his mind away from this train of thought. There was no point in going down that road again. He didn't need the hurt. He didn't need the disappointment. How did it go? A prophet is not respected in his own country. He saw the diner coming up on his right, and after fumbling for it, found the turn signal. Ron parked and looked the place over. It was a tired-looking building, despite its eternally tidy aluminium siding. The windows were nearly opaque with condensed moisture. It was typical in its anonymity, one of thousands just like it all over North America. The food would probably be bland but filling and totally unhealthy. The coffee would be brown hot water. He got out into the asphalt and gasoline smell, settled the unfamiliar suit around him, and then walked over to the door and opened it. Once inside, he was met by the sound of country music and a warm, greasy scent sparked through with cigarette smoke. Ron stood in the doorway and looked around. A thick-set blonde man in the last booth held up his hand, and Ron walked over to him. There were 2 other men with him in the booth. All 3 looked at Ron as though he were wearing feathers. Ron put his hand on his stomach and gave a small laugh. "Sorry about the suit," he said. "I thought I'd be less likely to draw attention like this." The blonde man nodded slowly. "Right," he mumbled. "Never know who's watching." The other two mumbled and shifted, somehow giving off a general air of agreement. Ron had expected an invitation to sit, but since none was forthcoming, he plopped himself down beside one of the men. He looked them over as unabashedly as they examined him. They looked tough and determined. They did not look overly bright, but to Ron that was an advantage. They looked like the kind of men who would do what they thought was right, even if the rest of the world disagreed with them. Actually, they'd probably follow their code even if the rest of the world was shooting at them. And they'd never stop for a moment to take a second look at their beliefs. In their way, they were perfect. A waitress came over with a tired smile, and he ordered an orange juice and a piece of apple pie. "A la mode?" she asked. "Why not?" he said with a smile. He might take a sip of the OJ, but nothing on earth could make him eat the over-processed excuse for a pastry. And he certainly wouldn't touch the growth hormone-produced ice cream. Maybe one of his hosts would eat it. And he was their guest. The blonde had spoken to him at a book signing and suggested this meeting with like-minded men. So Ron sat back and waited, his eyes on the beefy man before him. He spread his hands in a gesture of invitation. "I'm John," the blonde finally said. "This is Paul." He pointed at a thin-faced brunette. "George." A tubby, balding guy nodded. "And let me guess," Ron said. He turned to the ferret-faced little man, grinning. "Ringo." "Louis," the man said, looking puzzled. Ah, so these were their real names. For a moment, Ron had given them more credit than they deserved. John, Paul, George, and Louis. Okay. The men opposite him raised their heads expectantly, and a second later, pie and orange juice were sat down before him. Ron smiled up at the waitress and said, "Thank you." "Anything else?" she asked, giving Ron's untouched pie and then him a glance. Heads shook. Ron picked up his fork and played with the mess on his plate. She walked away. Ron put his fork down. "So, gentlemen, what am I doing here?" he asked. The blonde man, John, fiddled with his cup, his eyes downcast. "You seem to mean what you were saying at that lecture there," he said. He looked up, faded blue eyes hard. "But so have some others we've talked to. They talked the talk, but they wouldn't walk the walk." Ron crumpled his napkin and tossed it onto his plate. "It's the money," he explained. "It's like a drug. It makes you forget it's just a tool, and it makes you think it was what you were working towards all along." And these men were tools too. They might not be the sharpest ones in the shed, but they'd do until something better came along. He could use them, and as long as they didn't know he was using them, they'd do whatever he asked. Ron had always known they were out there, people who were looking for a leader and a cause to die for. He could give them that, and they would give him the means to his own end. A world made pure. A world returned to simplicity and community, with the scientists and the industrialists and the politicians put back in their place as servants of the people. He leaned forward and began to learn who these men were and how they would fit into the black wing of the organization that he, as yet, could only dream of founding. But Ron was possessed by a vision and firmly believed that the future was always just about to fall into his grasp. "That ski lodge that got bombed," Louis said. "We know who did that. Couldn't keep the politicians from giving them a green light, even with all the petitions and protests we had." His little eyes gleamed with malice. "But they made damn sure the bastards couldn't open for business." The other men chuckled and sipped their coffee. Ron gave a disgusted "Tss" and waved his hand dismissively. "All they did was annoy the insurance companies," he said. "The politicians stayed bribed. The ski lodge owners still own the land, and they will rebuild. And that fire took 1,000 acres of woodland. Last I heard, the owners were planning to expand their operation since all that land had been cleared for them." Ron shook his head. "What a waste of effort." "So, what would you have done?" George challenged, looking like an angry Buddha. "I dunno," Ron said, looking thoughtful. "Nothing really destructive, though. Something that would amuse the public. Get them on your side." His gaze sharpened, and he looked at George in the face. "If you've got the public on your side, and I mean the majority, then you make it risky to impossible for the politicos to do their damage." He smiled wryly. "You've got to think like frat boys crossed with Navy SEALs." The men laughed. Before Ron left, their hard eyes had begun to glow with hero worship, and they'd made plans. LeBain opened his briefcase and took out a small, brightly wrapped parcel. "For startup expenses," he said quietly, handing it to John. "Happy birthday." Then he smiled and got up. Without another glance, he walked out into the night. Ron could feel their eyes following him, like plants following the sun, and he nearly laughed. Having acolytes was a heady experience. He'd have to watch himself, or he'd be swallowed up by his own ego. Sarah Connor's estancia, Paraguay, the present. Sarah hung up the phone, frowning. Then she headed down the hall towards her son's room. "John!" she called. "Mom?" "Something's up." "Something's up." It's about... Dieter," they said together. They blinked at each other. John had been about to rush into the hall looking for her, and she'd almost bumped into him. "He wants to come over," Sarah said. "I put him off until later tonight." "Check this out," John said grimly, jerking a thumb towards his computer, flicking his head to get the lock of black hair out of his eyes. Sarah sat in his chair and read the message on the screen. "Perry," it said, using her code name. "Been away. Von Rossbach reputed to be a covert operative for multi-government task force. Be careful, he's good." "Shit!" she snapped, smacking her fist on the table. Shit! She got up and paced the small room, one hand pulling at her hair, the other on her hip. "Do we go?" John asked. Sarah closed her eyes as if in pain, her face bleak. Was it necessary? Would it only make things worse? Heating up the cold trail that, up until now, no one had been able to pick up. She hissed and took a few more distracted paces across the room. I don't want to, she thought, not for the first time. I don't want this. She'd made a life for herself here, a lonely life, but a real one, and a life for her son, a life that included friends and prospects. He was 16. How could she ask him to follow her again? And how can I not? He wasn't just her son. He might still be the last best hope for humanity's future. Because one truth the hard years had taught her was that the last thing that tripped you up was the contingency you hadn't planned for. And no matter how calm the last few years had been, deep down inside her, she was still waiting for a disaster. But was this it? She thought with regret of the something she had sensed growing between herself and the big Austrian, something powerful and good, reaching through the fear and suspicion. Something she hadn't felt since Kyle came into her life. She'd held herself back from it as if it were fire and she were paper, but she couldn't deny it completely. Was it real on his part? Or had he known about her all along and merely been manipulating her until he could confirm her identity? Well, Victor certainly supplied that, she thought bitterly. She'd been hoping against hope that Krigo's great revelation had fallen on deaf ears. She couldn't afford to be so open, so vulnerable. When did I turn into such a gullible fool? She blew out her breath in disgust. So, tonight he was coming over. Would he be alone? If he wasn't, then there was probably someone watching the house already. So running wouldn't be easy. At least until they could pinpoint the sentry, if there was one. It would be better to wait for nightfall anyway. By then, Dieter would be here, and maybe she could use him as a hostage. And afterward? Could she dispose of him, since he threatened her son? Dispose of him, she thought, with a wry twist to her mouth. Dispose of him. I sound like a Terminator. She turned to John. No, she said at last. Let's wait and see what he has to say. We might be anticipating trouble we're not going to have. John tipped his head, his eyes uncertain. But she could see that he didn't want to go either. To once again enter that harsh world of running and hiding and trying to set up unobtrusively somewhere marginally safe. He was 16, and he already knew too well the definition of adventure. Someone else in deep shit, far, far away. Cyberdyne conference room, the present. Serena sat quietly in the meeting Paul Warren had called with his department heads. He wanted to be brought up to speed after his weeks away. Behind her mild, attentive face, she was conversing with her Terminator. It had landed in Asuncion and had been met by Cassetti. There will be a delay, the Terminator reported. Cassetti says the rental car won't be available until 3 o'clock. As long as you accomplish your mission and catch your flight back to the US, she said. If you aren't going to be able to complete your mission in time to make the flight, inform me, and I'll make other arrangements. Affirmative. It replied tersely. Since you'll be stuck in Asunción for a few hours, go interrogate Victor Grigo. Find out what Cassetti told him about me, then terminate him. You can probably stock up on weaponry at his office as well, which should simplify things for you. Affirmative. Also, find out if Cassetti has spoken to anyone else about this case. If he has, terminate them. Affirmative. Contact me when you have something new to report. Affirmative. Out. And she was left alone in her head to attend to the meeting. Not that it would require her full attention. All of the material being covered here was more efficiently available as written reports, which she had already read. As far as the I-950 was concerned, there was no real need for this meeting. He must want to demonstrate to his underlings that he's not a broken man, but is still capable of running the company. Though how anyone could be broken by the death of a woman like Mary Warren was beyond her programming. But humans had their forms to observe, and they imposed penalties on those who refused to acknowledge them. Serena looked across the table at the company president. He certainly looked thin and drawn in his black suit and tie. Was it grief, or had Mary left all her money to her favorite charity, handing him nothing but debts? I suspect that's just the sort of thing she'd do. If she were human, Serena sensed that she would feel sorry for the poor man. Mentally, she withdrew from the meeting again. This evening, she was meeting Jordan Dyson at the airport with his company car. A conservative but very serviceable XL. She imagined he'd be pleased. They'd have a business dinner to discuss his work for Cyberdyne. Then she'd take him to his new apartment, where she'd parked her own car. She'd present him with a map and directions to get him to work, and then she'd leave him to his own devices. I hope this will be a very useful working relationship, she thought. After all, they had a shared obsession. Even if, with a reasonably probable outcome, her T-101 was about to terminate the object of it. Aeropuerto Silvio Pettirossi, Paraguay, the present. I require access to Victor Grigo, the Terminator said. You will take me to him. Marco looked at the towering black-clad man out of the corner of his eye. He wished the man would take off his sunglasses. The totally expressionless face was hard enough to take without being able to see his eyes, and Marco really wanted to see his eyes, because what he could see of the stranger's face looked exactly like Dieter von Rossbach. Access? Cassetti said dubiously. You will take me to him. Si, Marco said with a shrug. But we'll have to take a bus. I don't have my own car. You will take me. Right this way, Marco said, and walked off through the slightly shabby, dated international-style spaces of the Asunción International Airport. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck begin to stir as the man fell into step behind him. This had come from the beautiful blonde angel that had hired him. What could be the matter with her? Was she collecting men of a certain type? That thought prompted another. Perhaps she wasn't a beautiful angel. Perhaps she was some demented witch who was actually collecting men who looked like von Rossbach and doing things with them. Certainly this one seemed to have been lobotomized. In which case, Senor von Rossbach was in trouble, but not from any terrorist. He was in trouble because Marco himself was going to bring it to him. He felt his heartbeat pick up a little, and a clammy prickle of sweat on his palms and under his armpits. Marco rubbed his hands unobtrusively on his slacks. The Terminator, following behind him, noted the slight elevation in Cassetti's heartbeat and queried the cause of it. The options listed at the query suggested that the Terminator itself was the cause, and the solution might be to say something amicable, showing the quality listed as empathy. The list presented offered 1. Are we walking too fast? 2. Is it much further? It opted to utilize the one that might explain the change in the human's heartbeat. Are we walking too fast? It asked. Cassetti's head whipped around so fast he got a crick in his neck. He said. Sorry, senor. You must be tired after your journey. He slowed down to an easy amble. The Terminator had to adjust its walking speed to avoid stepping on Cassetti's heels, but didn't bother to adjust for distance, which meant that they were walking in perfect unison, 2 inches apart. Calm down, Cassetti told himself. There was no need to distress himself like this. A woman who collected men who looked alike and then lobotomized them. Absurd. He was working himself into a sweat over a pipe dream, just as his mother so often said. They got on the bus. It took off in a cloud of diesel fumes through the hot, crowded streets. It was hot and crowded itself, but they managed to get seats, and sat without talking until they had to transfer. The stranger asked Marco why they were getting on a different bus. This struck Marco as odd. Surely even in the United States they had to change buses. This time they had to stand. The stranger never held on to anything, and he never lost his balance, which was odd for a man as tall and heavy as he was, especially considering the number of bumps the driver managed to find in the road. Cassetti told himself this was evidence of martial arts training, something he hoped to one day be able to afford for himself. With anyone else, he would have asked questions, but not this man. They got off near Grigo's building. It was old enough to be thought an eyesore, but not to be quaint. Grigo's sleazy office was on the 3rd floor. There was no elevator. The Terminator looked around the tiny lobby, noted the staircase, and turned to Marco. Wait here, it said. I'll be back. Cassetti opened his mouth to speak, but the stranger had already turned away. Marco figured that Grigo was probably used to dealing with tough customers, and so wouldn't be fazed by this one. And he knew he could use a break from the stranger's quelling personality. He leaned against the wall, put an unlit cigarette in his mouth, and began to practice rolling it from side to side with his lips. The Terminator climbed steadily, using its sensors to take note of human activity in the building. Heat traces, heartbeats, vocalizations. There didn't seem to be much going on presently. On the 3rd floor, it paused to give itself a better opportunity to gather data. From the sounds, it appeared this floor was deserted, except for one human. The door from behind which the signal came bore Victor Grigo's name and a number. It opened the door and entered the small office. The human was seated in an old leather office chair with his feet up on the desk, smoking a cigar and reading the paper. After a moment, the man lowered the paper impatiently. Whatever he'd been intending to say died on his lips, and he stared open-mouthed at the Terminator. "What the hell do you want now, von Rossbach?" Grigo said, his face reddening. "Did you forget to make some self-righteous remark when you threw me out?" He flung the paper down on the desk. "Well, I don't want to hear it. This is my turf you're on now, and I don't have to put up with you looking down your nose at me. So you can take a hike, buddy. Get out of here." "I need weapons," the Terminator said. Victor stared at it in wide-eyed disbelief for a moment. Then, gradually, he began to chuckle, then to laugh. "You're a piece of work, von Rossbach," he said. He leaned back in his chair, his expression nasty. "So, I'm still good enough to do business with, is that it?" "I need weapons," the Terminator repeated. Victor vowed to himself that von Rossbach would pay top dollar, and then some, for anything he bought. "Sure," Grigo said expansively. "What did you have in mind, and how many?" "What do you have here, right now?" The Terminator looked around the office. Nothing was visible. "Let me show you," Victor said smugly. He got up from his chair and sauntered around his desk to a painting beside the window, a copy of the Madonna and Child in an enormous Rococo frame. Victor placed his fingers just so on the bottom of the frame, and it swung open with a discreet click to show a recessed area cut into the wall, holding a dozen different weapons on pegs. The Terminator reached in, took down a Galil assault rifle, and examined it minutely, working the action and looking down the barrel. The chrome-lined interior shone with careful maintenance. The sound of the bolt indicated wear, but well within parameters. "You have ammunition for this?" it asked. Grigo frowned. "These are samples," he said. "That is acceptable. You have ammunition?" The Terminator turned to look at Grigo, who chewed on his cigar and swallowed with a sudden unease. "Sure," he said. "But I don't like to sell my samples, and I don't guarantee them." He raised a cautioning finger. The Terminator nodded. It turned back to the case and selected an Austrian Steyr machine pistol and an American grenade launcher that looked like a fat single-barrel shotgun. "What are you doing?" Victor protested. "Are you trying to clean me out?" "I'll need a case to carry these in," the Terminator said, laying the guns down on the desk. "You have something?" Victor glared, but nodded. Of course he did. One frequently had to bring these things in and out, and they looked a little conspicuous, wrapped in plastic bags. "It will cost you extra," he said between his teeth. This was getting to be a bit much. Von Rossbach was conducting business with him as nearly as possible as though they were in different rooms. On top of the way Dieter had treated him the other night, it verged on intolerable. Even the prospect of the obscene profit from this transaction was waning in attractiveness, while throwing von Rossbach out began to appeal. "The case, the ammunition," the Terminator said, turning to look down at Grego, its face impassive. "That's it," Victor snarled. "I don't have to put up with this, von Rossbach. Who do you think you are, coming in here as though nothing happened? No apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. Making demands left and right, like I'm some servant." He stepped forward and pushed his face up towards the Terminators, while aggressively poking it in the chest with a chubby finger. "Well, I don't need you. If the sector wants to buy from me, they can just send someone else. Because as of right now, I'm terminating this transaction." "I have questions for you," the Terminator said. "Oh, do you?" Victor sneered. He picked up the Steyr from where it lay on the desk. "Well, that's too bad, because I'm not going to answer them. Now get lost." Grego attempted to put the gun back on its pegs, but the Terminator snatched it out of his hands and pushed him in the chest. Victor stumbled backwards, his knees folding as they hit the windowsill, and he fell through the open space. Before he could even scream, the Terminator grabbed one of his legs and held him suspended upside down over the alley, 40 feet below. "I have some questions," it said. All right. Pull me in and I'll answer them." Victor reached towards the window helplessly, completely unable to do anything but hang at the end of the Terminator's arm. "Please!" he pleaded, terrified. "Help me!" Fingers clawed the air. "Ammunition. A case," it said. "For Christ's sake, Dieter! Pull me up!" "Answer me." There's a case beside my chair, next to the filing cabinet. You'll find ammo for all the guns in the cabinet, in a hidden drawer, under where the guns are displayed. Now pull me up!" Grego was in tears and was beginning to realize that von Rossbach might actually kill him. "Why?" he sobbed. "Why are you? Why?" "What did Cassetti tell you about his client?" The Terminator lifted 2 fingers from Victor's ankle, and Grego screamed frantically. "No! What?" The Terminator folded his fingers back around Grego's leg. "Cassetti, his client. What did he say?" He said she was a woman, and in the United States." "That is all?" Yes! Victor tried desperately to get his hands nearer to the Terminators, without success. "Please," he begged. "Please don't kill me." The Terminator calculated the odds of Grego surviving a fall from this height, particularly in a head-down position. The numbers came back in favor of this method of termination. It had the added advantage of perhaps looking like an accident or suicide. Grego watched its implacable face, hoping to find some clue to his fate there. The longer it stayed completely still, the more terrified Victor became. The man was on drugs or insane. He panicked and began to thrash around in mid-air. "Let me go!" he shouted, then realized what he'd said. "No!" But the Terminator had already opened its hand, and Victor was plummeting earthward. The Terminator watched the body impassively for a moment, noted that its temperature was already dropping, and turned to the weapons cabinet. It examined the bottom of the recess and found that the wood there could be moved. It lifted the lid at the bottom of the case and found several boxes of ammunition concealed below. It took several dozen magazines of 5.56, a dozen 32-round magazines of 9mm parabellum for the machine pistol, and both of the 40mm grenades, then closed the cabinet. It retrieved the case from behind Grigo's desk and filled it with weapons and ammunition, clicking the catches shut and hefting. The weight was less than 20 kilos, not nearly enough to degrade mobility significantly. The door opened and Cassetti came in. The Terminator's head snapped around, but it maintained its position. "I told you to wait," it said. "I got bored," Marco snapped back, playing it more cocky than he felt. "So, where's Grigo?" he asked, looking around. "He just dropped out," the Terminator said. It picked up the case and started for the door. "What's that?" Marco asked. "Something we arranged before he had to go," the Terminator answered. "We must leave. By the time we get back, the car will be waiting." It stood in the doorway, its concealed eyes fixed on the young detective. Cassetti looked around the office uneasily. This wasn't right. He knew it wasn't right. Grigo hadn't come down the stairs while he was climbing up, so where could he have gone? He wouldn't leave his windows open and a stranger in the room, would he? "Did he say where he was going?" Marco asked. The Terminator looked at him while it processed his question. Deception was required. "The can," it said at last. The human's face showed doubt quite clearly. Its processor suggested that the length of time it had taken to answer had aroused suspicion. "It took me a minute to think of the Spanish for that," the Terminator explained. "Oh," Cassetti said. He was still a bit uneasy, but it was plausible. Barely. "If you want to talk to him, you have to come back later. My plane leaves at 7:30, and I've got things to accomplish before then," the Terminator said. "Sure," Marco said, and headed towards it. The Terminator looked at him for another second, then headed out. Marco followed it closely, pulling the door closed behind him. It still didn't feel right to him, but it would be stupid to hang around, only to find out that Grigo had in fact simply gone off to use the toilet.